So what we're talking about today is wage hours, wage um, development, and crew and productivity. And the intent is for everybody to be able to articulate labor hour development, what a productivity rate is, productivity factor is, what a production rate is, what a U.S. Gulf Coast standard is, what the resulting wage rates are and what they represent and how they apply to crew rates. And again, I think for those of you that have more construction experience, this will all fall in line with some of what you're already doing. So this may not be that new. So the labor hours themselves, or the labor cost, which often is just called labor, is a result of applying wage rates of some development that contains some particular items, and it varies based upon a company's uh, philosophy against extended activity hours. And that extended activity hours is quantity times a production rate times a factor, and that's really usually stands for or represents the self-performed activities that a company is going to take on. The development of subcontract labor is actually very much the same, but it's captured in your subcontract column because it's part of a subcontract cost, or it's part of a subcontract. So the development of it by the subcontractor is going to follow the same process as the prime contractor, but it relates to their own scope of work. And so therefore the prime is going to put it in two different categories. Sidebarring for a second, depending upon how a company sets up its summary sheet, I've worked at companies where subcontracts are more or less quantity driven and related to quantity only. And so it's a unit cost against a quantity, and that's the end of it. And I've had others where we try to break out the subcontract hours. And so we'll literally have a quantity column. We'll have self perform hours and a subcontract hours. Then we'll have labor, material, and subcontract costs. So we're trying to track and capture the subcontract hours as well. Primary reason is that you have to manage the subcontractors, and the best way to try to figure that out is know how many craft hours are on site and when. So they're even though they don't impact your indirect costs like self-perform craft do, they still impact your indirect costs in some manner. So the labor hours, um, in the first module we discussed how to develop one. In module 4, the last 4 modules, we've been talking about how to quantify and discuss the fact that quantification is the fundamental basis of the estimate because it represents activities as well as materials. So everything is being driven by those quantities. Now, to develop the labor hours, we need to determine what our production rates are going to be to apply to those quantities. And again, those quantities that we took off, that we created, in some cases, it's a one line item. It represents an activity and a material in one, and that's it. In other cases, that quantity can be applied to many different tasks and different materials. And the example would be you take off a ton of steel, it's a ton of steel to install. So you're going to apply hours against it, price those hours, and then you're going to price the material, and you're pretty much finished with the exception of trying to capture your connections. Meanwhile, if we take off a wall, an interior wall of a building, that square footage can apply to the sheetrock, can apply to the stud work, unless you convert it to board feet, can apply to the tape and floating, texturing, and the painting, and the insulation that may go in there. So that MTO applies to several things whenever you take it off. And whether you want to take care of all the sub items and calculate it individually, or you roll it into a composite. You have that option. So, but in either case, in all of those cases, once you have your quantities and your activities identified, we need to apply labor hours against it to start the process. So once you know your activity, um, in this case, we're using medium steel or concrete, that will lead you to trying to determine what the hours are that you're going to apply, because it's not universal. Every system usually has some underlying database that the hours are contained in that you're applying against your activities. Um, whether you're using a third party CAN program like ACE that I've discussed before, that it's very engineering oriented, and um, it has algorithms that can create quantities for you. Even behind that, there's a whole list of activities that you're going to select from, and it usually will select them for you unless you start going in deep into the system and determining individual items. But on the other hand, if you're using a program like Sage Timberline or WinEst or Cleopatra, those programs you have to build your database. They don't You can purchase database and drop them in, but generic. And I think all of you or most of you can relate to that, where the programs that your company is using is probably either HCSS, that heavy bid program, or maybe Timberline. I don't know. Are y'all using any other programs other than those two that you know of?
Yeah, we use ProEst.
ProEst. Okay,
Yeah.
I've heard of ProEst. It's building construction related, so I'm not too familiar with it. But all those programs, when you receive them, they're somewhat like Excel in that it's blank. You have to put in it what you want. But being that they are, you know, third party CAN programs, they have all the math and the structure built into it. You just have to put the data, create the database for it to pick from. Uh, and that can be quite a bit of effort. But when you're done, you may have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of activities. So when you type in a code and it brings up the material quantity you're wanting to install, it grab, it'll pull that rate in. I've worked with proprietary programs. Brown and Root, back in the day, had a system that they designed and maintained in house. It was that they wrote it initially in COBOL, and then they eventually um, converted it to Visual Basic, and I think later on they converted it to C++. So they had programmers in the estimating department that was their job, was to maintain and develop the program, and so they did what they wanted. But they had a database that sat underneath it, just like the others that you pick from, and you use codes to bring up to the surface depending upon the activity or the MTO that you had created. And then there's sophisticated Microsoft Excel templates. I've had some that I asked where you could type in a code using the index formulas, and it pulled from a database just like WinEst or ProEst or Timberline or some of those things. But you had to build everything because Excel is just a blank sheet when you start. But it can be a really solid program. And I'm providing you an Excel program, but it doesn't have a database underneath it that you can use for this activity. But nonetheless, going back to tons of steel or cubic yards of concrete, there's got to be a database you're pulling from that references those production rates. And so when I talk about production rates, it's a generic um, basis that's
Claro, claro.
tons per hour we can install, or how many cubic yards or hours per cubic yard we can install. Was there someone had a question? Um, and so what sits inside of these programs is what we call um, book rates, bogeys, go bys, database standards. The terminology changes by company or by person, depending upon kind of how they quote unquote grew up within the systems. Um, but they're just a generic standard. And going back to the Excel as my a note here at the very first note is that some of these programs, this will build this particular estimate for this class in the next task, is you'll have a book to the side that you can pick your rates from, and then you can hard code those into your estimating program. One way to picture that is even today, as people put together estimates, even if they have a program like Sage Timberline, or if they have a unique activity and they go look it up in RS Means or some other reference manual, they can identify the production rate that they want to use, and they can type it in the system, and it overrides the blank or the lack of information if they didn't have a rate in the system that they could use. Same general process. It's more of an old school approach, but it's perfectly valid. So the question is what are book rates? Like I said, they're generic unit rates. They represent somebody's ability to install that material, whatever you've recognized, in a very generic way. So hopefully, depending upon what that basis is, it recognizes current modern safety practices and execution practices. And what I mean by that is a lot of the computer systems today in the industrial world still sit on top of old rates that were developed in the 60s and particularly the 70s and early 80s. And if you hear somebody talking about paginations, that Page and Nation were two fellows that accumulated production rates from a bunch of different companies, and they turned around and they published them. And you can still today go buy books on installing pipe, installing equipment, installing offshore platforms, and offshore pipelines by Page and Nations. Another well-known set of data is Logie Nost, Knost. That fella pulled a bunch of info. He worked for a company in Baton Rouge, and that company did a lot of studies and generated similar data to Page and Nations. But when that company was bought out, he left, kept the information, and he published it. And so a lot of companies in the Baton Rouge area, that Louisiana area, their databases sit on top of Logie Nost, while nationwide you have a lot of companies sitting on top of Page and Nations. But again, the problem is that a lot of that data reflects studies and productivities that were known in the 1970s. A lot of cases, the method of installation hasn't changed significantly, but it has changed. A couple of areas, the changes actually don't hardly matter, even though we now do a lot of welding automatically. They use automated machines to weld instead of hand welding. The time that it requires to set the machine up burns up the amount of time saved by the machine. And so the actual welding time is almost the same. But we still primarily weld using weld by hand, whether it's a rig welder or a single hand welder using a welding machine that's been provided by the company. But on the other hand, areas that have really impacted productivity is safety. Because back in the 70s, guys were riding crane balls up to upper levels. And I mean, we're talking 75 to 300 feet in the air, and they're not tied off riding a crane ball. Today, you'd be fired once you got 4 feet off the ground. In fact, you'd probably be fired the moment you stepped on the ball because they know what you're getting ready to do. And so the even we have 100% tie off policies now. We have lifelines that have to be set up now, and you'll see lifelines and highway and in buildings and industrial. They're everywhere. You can't. You used to be able to walk with the steel. Now you have to scoot on the steel. Now we have mandatory stretching in the mornings. We have the JSAs, the job safety analysis that has to be talked through every morning before the day starts. And we have regular scheduled breaks. And the lunches, the craft get to go to a lunch tent and take 45 minutes or so to break for lunch. Years past, their breaks and the lunch was kind of breaking place. There wasn't a common place. That's why they have that photo of those guys eating lunch on the steel building the Empire State Building. I did a little bit of research on that one, and they're literally sitting about 825 feet in the air when they took that photo. They're not tied off. They're just sitting there eating a lunch. They broke in place. Reality is that the next floor, if they were to fall off, fell in, they probably only fell about 14 feet because they probably had the next floor is probably built in. It was just their level, the level above. They could have fallen 24 feet possibly. But if they fell out, they would have fell about 800 feet.
Just
but-
for the record, Professor, it's I forgot where, but there was a study that says those people who had less safety measures were a lot more conscious about their own safety than modern construction workers who actually don't care. They think that they are 100% safe and they end up dying.
That wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't, because when you get comfortable, I mean, it's kind of human nature, right? When we get comfortable, we tend to get a little lazy.
Yeah.
About the environment or situation we're in. So I could see it.
You just reminded me, with us talking about riding the crane ball and all that stuff, is 20 years ago when I was working on it. Then it was Enron Field, now Minute Maid Park, obviously. The iron workers, the bent I-beams coming down that held the roof structure, they'd lay on their back with their gloves and slide down, holding on with their hands behind their head, using the soles of their boots as brakes as they slid down and came to a stop vertically at the base. They can't do that stuff anymore.
No,
That's
that's a
crazy.
way to get fired. Man, I don't know if I'd if I'd even goofing around if I would do something like that.
I mean, it was the Wild West back then, especially with the iron workers up there hanging structural steel. It was just crazy the things that they would do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's
Sky-
also
Skywalkers, they call them, by the way.
yeah. Well, there was a tribe of Indians, Native American,
Right.
that had like no fear of height and had really good balance, and they worked a lot of the skyscrapers. They said those guys were incredible up there.
Yeah,
with
the
balance.
Skywalkers. The
Yeah, the
Skywalkers.
Yeah, that's better than me. That's all I can say.
Anyway,
But yeah, that whole safety concept, though, even though it's something that we need, it carries a cost with it, and that cost is primarily in productivity. And so, if you know your system's sitting on all those old production rates, then before you ever start, you need to apply 5 to 15%, maybe 20% to the rates just to get them up to current standards, and then you can start moving forward from there even. So I think this this slide here, I think, makes a point that most everybody that's on listening right now already understands. That is, if you have 100 tons of medium steel and you have a book rates that you're going to reference, we usually recognize somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 different concepts or 3 different scenarios for steel. And when I say 3 different, it's 3 different categories. It still breaks out all the subcategories of extra light through extra heavy, and then the miscellaneous. But it's the circumstance in which all those subcategories are being installed. One is pipe rack, one is open structure, and one is miscellaneous. So the difference is that the pipe rack, it's usually comprised of medium and heavy members, or medium and heavy and extra heavy members, and it's like dominoes. You're putting them up. It's very repetitious, and so you get into a rhythm and you're moving. So it's usually the most productive of them all. So let's say in this case you're an average of medium weight, so we're looking like 25 hours per ton. An open structure is less repetitious, but it's still STILL, still going to be erected in a similar manner as the pipe rack, but it will have more miscellaneous components in it, being grading, checker plate, handrail, ladders, stairs, things of that nature will be blended in there. But if we ignore the miscellaneous part and just look at the regular steel, the light, medium, heavy, extra heavy steel components, it probably is going to average somewhere around 30, just because of less efficiency. You can't really get in the same rhythm. And then you have a miscellaneous, which it's really fairly random. And that is, you have a bunch of T-poles that aren't in a line like a pipe rack, they're just spread out. Or you have some small structures that are spread out all over the site. So you have to go and set up and then put this together and then break down and move over and then set up again and then put that together and then break that down and set up. And so you have a lot of setup and breakdown per ton of steel. And so it starts driving up your hours. It's driving down your efficiency rate. And so if you have those 100 tons of steel, depending upon which one of your scenarios, it would drive a difference in your wage rate. In this case, if we said it's an open structure, the 30 hours a ton times 100 tons give you about 3,000 hours. That's hours to erect that steel. Now, depending upon what the average is, we would then add anywhere from 4 to 12% for connections. But one thing to remember is your connections primarily consist of medium weight steel. So you could take, if you had 100 tons and it was medium steel, which is probably around 8%, connection weights, you'd have 8 tons of connection steel. And then if medium is 30 tons, 30 hours per ton, then you'd have another 8 tons of 30 hours that you'd add on top of your 3,000 hours. So you'd end up having, what is that? 3,240 hours total to install that steel. But again, at this point, if you're just sitting on top of your book rates, and hopefully you know whether or not it's been modernized or not. If it hasn't been modernized, you need that 3,240 hours needs to be multiplied times a modernization factor to get it up to today's practices. And then there's another concept called United States Gulf Coast Standard. And every company, the ironic thing is they call it a standard, but everybody has their own view of what that standard is. And what that standard represents is an average along the U.S. Gulf Coast, and we're primarily talking Louisiana, Texas, but specifically it represents the average conditions that you would experience in the Texas Gulf Coast in average weather, congestion, and so forth. So they're really what they really have in mind is somewhere in the Beaumont, Port Arthur area. So it's semi Louisiana, but even though it's still Texas, but you've got a lot of plants in Louisiana that are just as close to it as Houston. So you're kind of in that Houston to Beaumont area, maybe into Lake Charles, right in that corridor right there. So it's what would in springtime under non-rain conditions, average decent weather, average congestion, average height impact, average plant conditions. What would it take to install something? And that's what the U.S. Gulf Coast is supposed to represent. So if you know that you're still sitting on the old Page and Nation costs or hours, and you need to bring them up to current to reflect the safety, and then you need to bring them up to what you understand your Gulf Coast to be. And if Page and Nation is already has your Gulf Coast represented, you don't have to put anything else on it. Because theoretically, Page and Nations is supposed to represent a U.S. Gulf Coast standard, but that doesn't mean that it does. It's just intended to. So every company needs to understand how it operates, particularly in these situations. But by understanding what your U.S. Gulf Coast standard is, then when you apply those rates to every project you ever build, theoretically, those projects should be on equal footing, and you could analyze the difference in the projects, apples to apples, that way. Some companies choose to keep their book rates reflecting what they consider to be a modern book rate, but not a U.S. Gulf Coast. And so they have a standard factor they apply to it to bring it to Gulf Coast, and then they have another factor that they put on it to bring it to site. The reason some companies do that is that if you steal their production rates, you don't know what their U.S. Gulf Coast standard really is unless you have their table. So they view it as protecting their production rates. Other companies, their database reflects the U.S. Gulf Coast rates because they only want to apply one set of productivity factors, and that's it. Because people start getting confused when they're putting 2 or 3 different productivity factors against the base rates. Everybody has struggles to keep them straight and understand why they're needed. But in this case, the examples I'm giving you, the samples that I'm giving you for production rates that you'll use in your estimate, they're assumed to be U.S. Gulf Coast standards. So there's nothing else to apply other than the site. So what do I mean by site productivity? If we're already building everything into the database, and your database represents U.S. Gulf Coast, which means it's a standard that represents nice weather, reasonable congestion, etc., on the Texas Gulf Coast, then what else is there to take into consideration? The answer is that every job is different. So as you move north, it's colder, south is hotter, Midwest has tornadoes, Gulf Coast hurricanes. You go to the West Coast, there's earthquakes over there. So you had acts of God that you have to deal with. It's hot and dry in the desert. It's humid, wet in the forests, Northeast, Pacific Coast, Chicago. Those areas are highly union, and that includes Ohio and West Virginia. You start moving into Virginia and across the Midwest, they're a little, it can kind of go either way. They're merit shop based more than anything. And when you get into the South, it's primarily open shop. So that impacts your productivity, impacts your wage rates. Internationally, the US, Europe, Japan, Australia, the coast of China are heavily mechanized, use a lot of hand tools and a lot of equipment. You move out of those areas into other parts of the world, depending upon whether it's second world or third world categorization, they become more and more manual in the way they do things. They'll use hand tools instead of power tools. I mean, it was, I'm not sure what the practice is today, but I know that just 20 years ago, when in the United States we're erecting steel scaffolding, they were still using bamboo scaffolding in parts of the Middle East. They would have 50 guys walk over there and pick up a pipe spool and carry it across the site instead of three guys, 2 riggers and a crane operator go over there and latch on to it with your cables and then use the the crane to carry it over there. Or maybe a forklift instead if it was small enough, short enough. Just different mentality. And then the labor laws are different. In Europe, there's a lot of countries that the standard work week is 34 to 38 hours, and they will not allow you to work more than 44 or 48 hours in a week. It's illegal to work more than that. You have to have some special permit. And when you do, the overtime is 2 times, not time and a half. So there's a lot of different scenarios to think about, a lot of different impacts to your costs. But then within the sites themselves, once when you start thinking less about the environment that the site's in, you think about the site itself, you have even more compounding aspects that impact your productivity. How vertical is it? How tall is the average work front that you're dealing with? Are they going to be dealing with chemicals? Are they in a live plant or working around in and around a live plant that has chemicals in it, which is require special PPE? I know that whenever we have to break open lines for tie-ins, they may have to be in a full suit with respirators because we don't know what's in the line, or they know that what's in the line is very hazardous to your health. In other cases, they're working. There's one job we did a while back. They were working near a large kiln, and it was actually a heater, and that whole area was extremely hot. And then it was already Texas summer, so where normally they're walking around sweating because it's 98 to 100 degrees, everything around this furnace was around 125 degrees because of the heat that it was putting off, and so made it for a difficult work environment. Congestion, overhead obstacles. We've had jobs where we had to have blankets that we put over all the electric cables that were running next to where we're working. So just in case a crane actually to bump in and touch it or something, that it would keep everything from shorting. So some locations are based on new technology, and that drives construction engineering inefficiency at times. And particularly if engineering is struggling to figure it out, and then construction is trying to work with that, construction's never built it before. The compressed schedules, night shifts, that tends to impact productivity if everybody's being rushed and the stress level goes up, or they're working long hours and tiredness is coming in. And we're kind of related to congestion is dense versus spread out. So if you have a job that's really spread out, maybe you don't have congestion, but now you're losing productivity, travel time. While if it's really dense, you're not losing travel time, but you are having access problems due to the congestion. So all that impacts your site. So the key at this point is to develop a productivity factor that calculates all the impacts to your job site, and you apply that to your US Gulf Coast. So you literally, possibly, I haven't actually seen it, but you could have a job site that actually is more friendly than a standard US Gulf Coast site. Like I said, most of the time I haven't seen it because they're supposed to be ideal situations and nothing's ever ideal. But one job might require a productivity factor of 1.2, which is fairly low. 1.3 to 1.45 is pretty typical. 1.45 to 1.75, it's pretty congested and you're working around a lot of live active plant systems and so forth, and it's impacting you because you have work permits and it's hot and so forth. And then if you have a lot of turnaround work, night shift, very dense, very congested, everybody's tired because they're working 80 plus, 75 to 84 hours a week, your productivities can get over a 2. So that's kind of the ranges we typically see, but it's impacted by weather, craft availability, local craft skill, working schedule, height impacts. The more vertical it is, the more productivity loss you have to people having to get up and down the stairs and ladders and working at height to get materials there. People a little more nervous if it starts getting too high, so forth. So I think
You're applying this factor to the USGC, right?
that is correct. Yes.
Yeah, okay. I have a more simple. I might have missed it. Those labor hours you're talking about, are these similar? When I used to do estimating back 20 plus years, we used to have this labor hours. When we say 0.5 labor hours, it's not really 30 minutes for one person. It's labor. It's combined labor hours for a crew of people for a specific discipline.
That's correct. Exactly. It's not,
Okay.
it's a half an hour worth of
Crew time.
1 to 15 people,
Right.
depending upon the type of crew and so forth. Yes. So we're talking about crew, we're talking about production hours that represents a crew. And we'll talk about crews at the end. And
Okay.
it'll be
All right.
more
That's
pertinent
that.
industrial.
Yeah, that I needed to remember because I forgot how we used to calculate the crew hour.
Yes. So it's important to know whether or not your base database hours reflect just a generic basis, or whether or not they are US Gulf Coast, and whether or not they've been brought to current and reflect all the current safety precautions or practices that your company follows. And some companies are very, very safety conscious. Others are moderately safety conscious. So each company has to make its own assessment. This is how we operate. And if you're with a company that has moderate precautions, you think that that's reasonable and all that's needed, but you decide to go work at ExxonMobil in one of their project sites and they're very safety conscious, then when you put your site productivity against your US Gulf Coast standard, you need to bump it up a little bit more for their safety issues that are required. There's most of the companies I work for have been quite safety conscious, and we didn't have to do that except for one plant down in Chocolate Bayou, Texas. And that plant has always been notorious for being extremely particular about everything. And so I've worked in and around that plant with 2 or 3 different companies, and we all had to apply some extra precaution, an extra factor against our base hours because of that place. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's an additional cost because they want you to stop and check and verify, and you have to carry more things with you. It just takes more to do it. All right. So once that's done, you have your quantity, you apply your US Gulf Coast standard, against your hours. I mean, you have your quantities, you apply your unit hours against those quantities, you'll have what is then your extended hours that represent US Gulf Coast. You apply your productivity factor against that, and you'll have your site hours, the hours that should be required to install things at your unique site. Now, what's left at that point is to apply a wage rate. So wage rates vary, and they vary for a number of reasons. They're not all wages are the same. You have direct driven craft, you have direct non-progressible craft, you have indirect craft, you have staff and supervision, and you have home office labor. And even though it's just people working and getting paid, the salaries and the conditions around those salaries are all different. Your direct driven craft are those that are directly installing the permanent materials. The non-progressible direct craft or the crafts that are participating in the installation of the permanent materials, but in an indirect manner, like a crane operator. 1 minute the crane operator is helping install some rebar, it swings over and will help install a piece of pipe, and then it'll swing over and help install a piece of steel, and then swing back over and help with steel. I mean, the rebar again. Now, it may have to drive around the site to do it, not sitting in one place swinging back and forth, or it might. It just depends on its location, how big the site is, and what's going on. But the fact is that the rebar benders, they worked all day installing rebar. The crane operator was helping 3 or 4 different people throughout the day. Another one is scaffold builders. They're helping multiple different locations. They are, in my opinion, indirectly supporting direct craft, but everybody agrees that they're a direct cost these days. And so I say everybody, most seem to, because in the past they were in the indirects, and it was about 5 years ago that there was a move by a number of companies to move them to the directs. And so every company I've been with since then has them in the directs. They're one and the same. So it must have been an industry-wide decision to shift. But then you have your indirect craft, and they are the folks that are in the laydown yards, moving material around. They're working in the warehouse. They're performing dust control. They're maintaining the roads that the construction roads that are being driven on, and so on and so forth, and maintaining temporary facilities. They're craft just like the direct craft, but they tend to have a lower journeyman composition. They have more apprentices, or they're less experienced journeymen so their wage rates tend to be slightly lower, and consequently, they also don't qualify for per diem quite as heavily as the direct craft do. And then, of course, staff, but they're all hourly. You move the staff and supervision. Now you're moving to primarily salaried individuals that are working inside, and so they not only are salaried, but since they're salaried, they have a different burden benefit structure. And then you move to the home office; they're primarily salaried personnel also, but the staff, supervision, and home office personnel, they're not quantity driven hours. They're level of effort hours. They're schedule driven hours. So while the direct driven craft are purely quantity driven, and the non-progressible direct craft are driven by the quantities in an indirect manner, indirect craft, on the other hand, are schedule driven, just like the staff and supervision, but they're craft, they're hourly, and they have hourly craft benefits instead. So all these aspects change the actual base wage rate. In addition to that, the staff and supervision and home office may or may not be paid for their overtime worked. while all the hourly personnel are. Often what I've seen is a lot of home office people are pure salary, strict salary. Staff and supervision in the field are salaried, they get paid overtime, but they get paid straight overtime because they're salaried. And then all the craft who are hourly get paid uh overtime, and they get paid time and a half because they're hourly, and it's by law they have to. So salaried personnel by law do not have to be paid overtime. So you get a little bit of that indiscretion that's in there.
So Professor Whitman, let me ask you a question about that. So
Yes.
you have I mean, it's 1-to-1 on a regular person, like time and a half. If they work 10 hours 1 week, you pay them time and a half of their raw rate, right?
Yes.
So say you have a salary person that is indirect, and then you put them, you have them on a job. Just so happens it's 2 months. It's direct for 2 months. What's your obligations then?
Well, if they're salaried, you don't have to pay them overtime at all by law. If they're actually salaried. However,
Even if they go from, excuse me, I didn't interrupt you, but even if they go from indirect to a direct position for a couple of months, say you have them in indirect, they're overhead, and then all of a sudden project comes up, you got to put them in a direct, and let's say it's direct for 65, 70 hours a week for 2 months of the 12 months.
yeah,
What's your obligation then?
by law, it's are they exempt or not? Are they salaried
Exempt,
or hourly?
yeah.
Yeah, their
And-
salary, they're exempt.
If they're salary, they're exempt, and therefore you don't have to. But most of the time, in the companies I've been, they get paid it. And they do it not because of a legal obligation, they do it for retention.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the folks in the home office, they're paid a strict salary. You work 30, you work 50, doesn't matter. You get your 40-hour base paycheck done. And of course, the reality is no one ever works 30. You always work 40 or more, but unless you are forced to take a vacation. So it's kind of the idea of salary is kind of busted a little bit. Being in estimating, I've worked a massive amount of overtime over the years. 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week in the home office. But the vast majority of the time, they paid us overtime for it because they knew we were being pushed to do it. And they knew they want to retain us because after a while, everybody will go, I'm done with this. I'm going somewhere that's sane. And they lose everybody. But we were paid straight time overtime when we did it. Most every field job I've ever been to or worked in, they paid the field staff straight time overtime because they knew that even though legally they didn't have to, they knew they would never get anybody to work for them if they didn't.
But they paid them, but they were in a direct role, right? They were in a direct role. They weren't in an indirect role.
Well, the only people that are direct are the craft installing the materials, so they're in an indirect role.
Hmm.
So they're I'm talking about project controls, project managers, staff engineers, subcontract administrators, schedulers, site variance estimators, superintendents.
So then my question, were they able to invoice the client for that?
It depends on, yeah, they were. But it depends upon whether or not it was what the contract was. So, in other words, if it was a lump sum job, they theoretically were billing the owner for it because they were built into the lump sum cost. If it was a cost reimbursable job, then everybody there's paid. It didn't matter. But even on the lump sum jobs, they were paid that way because they knew they wouldn't keep them otherwise. In fact, I had one of the most recent industrial contractors I worked for, all pretty much 95% of what we did was lump sum work. And we would work 40, 45, 50 hours a week in the home office, and all we got paid was straight time. We just got our 40-hour our base paycheck. That was it. The only thing we could hope for was a bonus check at the end of the year. And sometimes they weren't so great, and sometimes they weren't too bad. But you didn't know until the end of the year. Meanwhile, the field, all the craft, they got paid what they got paid, what they worked, right? They have to be because it's law. But on the other hand, the field staff, and those staffs were small, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, 2 people in the field office. While when I go back to my Brown and Root, Fluor, Dane Zimmerman days, we would have 50 to 350 staff personnel in those offices because they're massive jobs. They're really big jobs, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. So you had a lot of staff in there. But they not only paid the staff and supervision overtime, they paid them time and a half, just like the hourly personnel, which I never understood. But their focus is we have to, because they're going to leave if we don't. They'll go somewhere else. And so it was a retaining. It was for retaining the people.
So 2 questions. I get the retention. So
Yeah.
2 questions, but if you have a field personnel
Uh-huh.
working in the field, they're not guaranteed 40. If you have rain or whatsoever, they're not, their salary is not, I mean, their work, their 40 hours is not guaranteed.
Correct.
But your office personnel, their salary is guaranteed, right?
Pretty much, yeah, because they can work whether it's raining or not. They'll go in the office, but they would still pay them. They would pay them, And the thing is, in industrial, the standard work week is 50 hours. We don't work 40 hours unless the client forces us to, and often we convince the client that's not very smart because we won't get any craft.
So-
Industrial craft will not go to a job site if it's working less than 50 hours a week because they want their overtime.
So it's a no-brainer if the client reimburses it, right?
Right. It's pretty straightforward. In fact, I heard we've got most of what we do right now, where I'm at right now. It's just we work whatever we have to work, and we bill up to 40 hours because everything we got to put our time sheets together by project. And so my timesheet looks crazy every week. I touch anywhere from 6 to 14 jobs a week. So I got 6 to 14 charge codes, even though I'm salaried and don't work over 40 hours a week. But we've got a job. There's a job I've heard that's coming, which is big, and it's client reimbursed. And if we work 50 hours a week, the client will pay us for 50 hours a week. So everybody will probably get it that works on that job. The ones that aren't on that job won't. So the favored people will be the ones on the job. You can see how that works. So that's the variation in type, but then there's other aspects that change the wage rates too. Overseas, you got foreign exchange. If you have, this is more of an overseas, country by country, but you actually have regions within countries too, where the economic status is different. If the country's not as industrial and developed, or the demographics, the education is not as high, so the skill levels aren't as high. Labor posture, union versus open shop, and also what industry, because just on average, industrial craft earn more than commercial craft, who in the commercial earn more than residential. That's not always true, but on average, I think you'll find that that's true. And also, the bigger the job, the more it tends to pay. And the smaller the job, the less it tends to pay. And that kind of follows the industrial, commercial, residential structure, because most of your a big residential project is like $1 million. Most of your houses are a few $100,000, right? While commercially, it's a few $1 million, if not 100, up to a couple $100 million. But industrially, our little bitty tiny jobs are a few million, and our big jobs are multi-billion-dollar jobs. So I got a buddy right now that they're getting ready to bid on a job, and it's supposed to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $75 billion. With it's B, 75 billion, not million. So the wages tend to follow that scenario, and but not always true, because you have the exceptions are is if you have a commercial building construction job that's $1.5 billion, the pay on that job I think is going to be more close to what you normally will see in an industrial project, and some of these industrial jobs that are really small will decline a little bit. Although the craft, you tend not to be able to draw the craft, even if it's only a $5 million job in the industrial work, because if that's all you're going to pay, they'll go to the bigger job. You still have to build it. So we kind of get stuck in that position where we've got to pay what it takes to get them there, or we won't get anybody there. It's the only exception is that industrial craft that want to stay home. Okay, they want to go home every night instead of live on the road and collect per diem. But they tend to work a lot of small jobs around a particular area, like the Houston Ship Channel, or they become maintenance personnel. And maintenance personnel earn less money, but then they get to go home every day. They go to the same place, and it's kind of like going to the office, except for they're on their tools when they do it. And I think their income is very comparable to the commercial building construction craft. So they just kind of, I think that kind of describes how it's flowing and why. So kind of high level, who earns the most? Welders. And who's right behind them? Instrument techs, electricians, millwrights, boilermakers, pipe fitters, crane and large crane operators, or crane operators in general. The iron workers, carpenters, scaffolders, medium size operators, equipment operators, they tend to earn like the average. Iron workers usually are somewhere in between the boilermakers, millwrights, and the carpenters. They actually a little bit more, but they kind of fluctuate. And then the rebar benders, painters, insulators, they earn less than average, and the laborers, the pure laborers, earn the least. So that's kind of the hierarchy and who gets what pay. I've kind of rolled this together a little bit. The pipe welders really tend to work, or they get paid about the same as millwrights and instrument techs. It's the combo welders and the rig welders that earn the most. And that's because they're certified for multiple materials. While a pipe welder that's not a combo welder, they're usually certified in one material, so they don't earn as much. And then the structural welders, they basically are certified to weld structural steel, not piping of any kind. They'll earn more along the lines of what the iron workers will earn. They don't earn much more, if any. So there's the welding category is really broken into three or four different subcategories, but for the most part, that kind of helps line out what the pay structure looks like. And where do the sources come from? Well, if it's open shop, it's market demand. Alpha Resources is a good source. Or if you have company histories and you know what you're paying out in the field, that's another good source. If you are in the Northeast, as I said earlier, Chicago, Pacific Coast, but that West Virginia, Ohio, up that area, you're pretty much guaranteed to be union. And so all those wage rates come from union labor agreements. Now, if you're working municipal, and I think this touches base with several of y'all, that tends to be Bureau of Labor Statistics based or Davis-Bacon Act based. Government, state, federal, large state and federal really leans on DBA quite a bit. The municipal, the local, and smaller state projects, regional, I've seen them base their wages on DBA, but I've also seen them lean on the BLS as well. And then when you go foreign, you have some really unique job. I've seen governments dictate wage rates. I've seen the client itself dictate wage rates, or I've seen the market take over, and it depends on what the market's demanding. So, government will trump the client and the market, and the client can trump the market if they so desire. Particularly if they both are saying something higher. If they're saying something lower, the market tends to overstep them, because you won't be able to get them there if you don't. So everything we've talked about so far is the W-2 rate. It's the bare comp. And that should, when we talk about bare comp, it should include premium time. So real quick, I think we all know what premium time is. So it's everything over 40 in the United States, at least everything over 40 hours is time and a half, unless you're working a holiday of some kind, and it can get to 200. But we tend to apply it as an average. So if you work 50 hours a week, we're applying 10% to all the hours is kind of a high level multiplier. If you're working 60 hours a week, it's 16.66% against all the hours, and that picks up the premium cost. So if everybody just earned the flat 10 hours, $10 an hour, and they didn't get that extra $5 on the last 10 hours of the 50-hour work week, then your multiplier would be 0. It'd just be a 1.0. But the premium cost is that extra 10% by being paid 150% in the last 10 hours, or the 16.66%, which is that 150% premium on the last 20 hours on a 60-hour week. A lot of times,
Wait a minute, Professor,
yes.
quick question. I may have missed something. Where does the vacation, PTO, sick time, whatever bennies they have, where does that come in?
That's in your burdens and benefits.
Okay, so you're not considering that at this point.
Yeah, at this point, all I'm talking about is just the base wage, and
Okay.
what we call bare comp. And so I'm trying to go fast so we can get to it, because then we're running out of time. But that's a good question. So
Well, we call it raw rate, but I understand. I didn't get that.
Okay. So the premium time is something you do want to identify, because it's a measuring tool, right? So even though the base comp needs to include it, it's good to know what that value is, so that you can identify whether or not you want to compress a schedule or not. What's the gain by paying more overtime, compressing the schedule, but finishing earlier, right? So there's in addition to actually just calculating it, knowing what it is valuable. So now, once you finish that, you've got your base comp. And as you start to move into your burdened, there's actually a step that I've my slide here kind of skips. And that is, we have a wage rate that we call bare, which is your W-2 plus your premium. That's what the laborer is, or the craft, or whoever is earning. That's their pay. But then we have one called base comp, and the base comp includes the multiplier, the PTO, the paid time off, or depending upon the company, it could be TOPE, time off with pay. But when you put that multiplier against there, a lot of companies are 10 to 15%. So let's just say 10%. So you're making 10 an hour. You're working 50 hours a week. Now that's a 1.1 multiplier. So you're now at $11 an hour average. And then if you have 10% for your PTO, multiply against that, now you're $12.1 per hour. So that's your base comp now is $12.1 per hour. And that's just pretty much a base comp. And so that extra $1.10 that we added for PTO, each paycheck, the worker never sees it. They only see their $11 that they earned, which is what they work for. But that $1.10 gets pulled by the company and dropped into a bucket, into a pool. And then whenever that person takes time off, then that $11 an hour that really is 10, when they get their $10 per hour for time off, it comes out of that pool that the $1.10 went into as it accumulates. So that's your base comp, and that's how that gets paid. But when you move into your loaded wage rates, now we're starting to get back to a lot of the other. You've got two different subcategories of your burdens and benefits: the burdens, which is your statutories, and your benefits, which is all the beneficial items that the company is paying for that the employee receives. So what's your statutories? Social Security, Medicare, federal unemployment, state unemployment, what I call FICA, FUI, SUI, and then workman's comp, family medical leave. Not everybody gets that. It depends on the state that you're in or the company you work for. And then company general liability, or contractor general liability. Some companies don't include this. The company I work for currently does not include CGL in the wage rate. They apply insurance at the project level, and basically it's an all risk insurance, covers everything. When some of the other companies I work for, we included CGL in the wage rate, and it covered basic things, kind of like your car insurance does for each one of us personally. And then they laid all risk on the job at the project level, but it didn't include the items covered by the CGL. So you had the insurance was kind of broken into a personal liability and then a project liability type situation. So it depends on the company as to whether or not, how you handle this. On the other hand, now also note, this is United States, because I've been working on UK and Canadian birds and benefits lately, and both of their overall tax base tends to be a little bit higher, and they cover similar concepts, but it looks completely different. Their categories are different. Their rates are different. It's just a lot. It's just different, but it provides similar items, similar benefits to it. Now, on the benefit side, you've got medical insurance, dental insurance, accidental death and dismemberment, short-term disability, long-term disability, life insurance, and I think you're all aware of that. And then the paid time off, sometimes it gets picked up here, but like I said before, normally it gets picked up in the base comp calc. So it depends on how the company looks at it. It could be in either way. It's still being picked up, but one will pick it up first, one will pick it up later. And then retirement contributions, pensions, profit sharing, all that kind of stuff gets identified in here. And so these are the benefits. The other ones are the statutories. You put them together, and that's what comprises your 18 to 55% multiplier that you put on your labor. I've seen craft bouncing between 18 and 25%, and I've seen staff bouncing between 46 to 56%. That's open shop. You move to a union environment, they've gone up lately, because in years past, all the union I was dealing with was like 56 to 72%. Now it looks like it's 72 to 105%. So the unions are now, they've been busted for mismanagement of their pension plans, and they now are billing extra money to refill the pension coffers that they owe the craft. So the craft aren't getting all of that necessarily. It's just they're charging for what the craft get today plus what they should have kept for the craft in the past. So it's an odd thing, but the union the markups are incredible these days. Um, 83+% not unusual anymore, which kind of blows my mind. Now, another per diem. I know we just hit time, but I want to try to see if we can finish because we're getting pretty close. Per diem is something that's very important in the industrial side. Like I was saying earlier, most of our craft are travelers. To qualify for per diem, typically you have to live 50 miles or farther from the project site. They are masters at finding a way to make their 35-mile home be 50 or greater. It's hard to track it down, and we know that issue exists, but to some degree we don't fight it too much because the craft rely on per diem and overtime to boost their income. And so typically, as over the years, as cost of living goes up, craft wages have only been going up 2 to 3%, 2.5, 2.6, 2.4% per year, which is well behind inflation. Meanwhile, home office personnel, we've been averaging 3 to 4%, 3.5% for years, while they're a whole percent behind. Difference is though as they get per diem, and per diems used to be 35, 45 a day. Then 5-6 years ago they're up around 65 to 70 a day. Right now we're paying craft 95 to 135 a day in per diem now to get them to come to site, particularly on our remote sites. So per diem is another income source for the craft, and they will travel to another job site to get the per diem if they can. And what's even better is that the first year is tax free. It's tax exempt because it's considered a compensation of expenses. Just like when we travel and we turn in expenses, we're not taxed on that because it's reimbursing us for costs that we've incurred. Per diem is the same for them. Once they get into 12, once they break into past 12 months, then they get taxed on it because the government says, well, if you've been there at least a year, you live there now. So you ought to be paying income tax on that. So we then have to plus it up. So if they're getting 100 a day, then we're turning around and paying them 135 starting at the beginning of the next year to compensate them for the taxes that they're incurring on it. But per diem's a big deal. And if we pay if we're working 5 days a week, some jobs we're paying 7 days of per diem to keep them on site. So it can be quite lucrative. Crew rates. I think everybody here, your crews are going to be a little different, but the concept's the same. Foreman, journeyman, helper. The difference is that in some of the smaller competitive companies that they are prime contractors, they do a lot of lump sum. Their crews tend to be smaller. Cajun, this is more like what our crew would look like, where it's really lean and mean. But at Fluor, Brown and Root, Black and Veatch, we usually blend it, have a lot more in there. We'll have equipment operators and all the different support people that kind of are helping are in there. We didn't have general foreman and Cajun. We had a superintendent run the job site and foreman down, made things happen. But our average job was $3 to $5 million. Meanwhile, we use a lot of general foremen, and general foremen are considered craft. Superintendents are considered staff and supervision. So that's the breaking point. So general foremen down are in our crew mix, Black and Veatch and Fluor. So you can see the difference in the structure, but the principle is the same. And we have a fairly detailed structure in how you start out as either you're a helper laborer and you're not going anywhere, or if you're an apprentice, every 6 months, if you pass the tests and you finish your time, you can move up until you hit month 48 and you certify as a journeyman. And then if you continue to go to school and continue to get certifications, you can move in the foreman and then in the general foreman. So the wage is going up every time they make this step, they qualify for it.
So Professor Whitman, explain this table for me. That piping for these are raw rates that it's their raw rate that's being paid to each individual, or these loaded rates?
These are raw rates
Okay,
because the burdens and benefits are going to be consistent across all the craft. Now, for open
Okay.
shop,
Okay.
merit shop, they're going to be the same. If it's 22%, it's 22%. But union, that's not true, because since you have union negotiated rates, not only is the wage rate negotiated, but the burdens and benefits are too. So that's why I was saying that I've seen rates that are like 72 to 105%. One craft made a negotiated 105% increase. I mean, burden and benefit rate. Another craft is only negotiated 72, while another one's negotiated 83. So when I'm building union rates, it's a lot more challenging than it is when I'm building open shop rates, because I still have this mix that I have to build, but the mix has, each one of these people in here has a different wage
Union.
calculation.
Yeah,
underneath
different.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it gets complicated.
so you're trying to track, what you're trying to track here is the hours associated, the cost it is. In other words, the cost to complete that work. Is that correct?
Exactly. So what'll happen is that, beforehand we had an activity, 100 tons of steel, and our book rate says, our U.S. Gulf Coast book rate says that's 30 hours per ton, which gives us 3,000 hours. Then we add our connections in there, and we get to 3,240. And then we say, oh, well, we got a productivity factor of whatever, 1.4 or 1.3 because of the site conditions. And so now our hours aren't 3,250 anymore, they're 3,500, let's say. So, but that 3,500 represents a crew hour. So then we come over here, build our crew, and now we have a crew rate of 3712. So that crew rate of 3712 gets applied to that 3,500 hours, and that's our labor cost.
Okay.
Can
So-
can I ask you something?
Yeah, I want to
How
ask.
did you add the numbers? Yeah, how did you add those numbers? I got lost. How did you get 3712?
3712 right here. Oh,
Yeah.
wait a minute. You can't see it anymore, can you? I just noticed that can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. My red line or my red border went away. I don't know what happened. So I thought I'd stop sharing for a minute. So if you have this mix of people here, and they're each making this individual salary, which you have to go research. If you multiply that out, total it ends up being 380.50. Divide that by however many people. This line here should be scooted over, so this drops to here and this drops to there.
Okay. So this
So
is what this.
divide your 3850 by 1025, and you get an average of 3712, which represents the average of all these together. And so you've got that 3,500 hours that we were talking about is represented by 10.25 people. Or if you had this crew up here, it would be 7 people, and this one here is staying in line. So you can see where it's $237 divided by 7 is 3386. So you have it's a different crew and a different crew average rate. Depends on how your company operates as to which one of these would be developed, right?
So let me follow this through and make sure I understand. So you have your crew rate, you would put your burden on that, and that would give you the cost to complete work. And then do you put your general conditions on top of that, and that's what you invoice the client?
It's even beyond that, even more than that.
Okay,
Now we don't have general conditions, we have indirect costs. And the reason that they're not the same, but they're similar, is that general conditions usually are related to a commercial contractor that's 100% subcontracting the work. and they're managing it. So the subcontractors have a lot of the indirect infrastructure, and the prime contractor has their management staff and a few of the general items, the general conditions. Since we typically self-perform 40 to 60% of the work, we have lunch tents, we have warehouses, we have maintenance shops, we have fabrication shops, we build parking lots, we build laydown yards, field offices. We have a full gamut of stuff. A lot of times we're putting up temporary fence, guard shacks, whole gamut. And so the indirect costs we have tend to exceed what you normally include in general conditions, but they're principally the similar things, if that makes sense. The other thing that I like, and I don't mean to confuse things, but I'm just stating the facts. Some companies like their direct cost to be base comp only. It only has the W-2 and the overtime premium, and that's about it. Others like to burden it. And so for the companies that use burden rates in the direct costs, the burdens and benefits for the craft are not in the indirects. For the companies that like to have base comp in the directs, then the associated burdens and benefits are in the indirects. Does that make sense?
Yes, it's just, I mean, it's a true cost. The burden is a cost, right?
It is. It is.
So-
And so it's kind of a debate, just like there's a debate. Some companies say crane operators are an indirect, like the equipment. Others say that they're a direct, like the people turning the wrench. And others say that they're a direct non-progressible because they're a direct cost, but they're not directly associated with installing that item. And so you've got that debate on
Yeah, it's
where
almost like an accountant. You have that crane operator working for a lot of different groups, right?
exactly. So my are there, and the only reason why I know there's companies that claim them to be direct non-progressible is because that's where I've argued them to be, and I've been able to get a company or two to buy into that because they wanted them in the indirects, and I'm going, they're not. They are helping install that piece of pipe directly. It's just that since you can't track them because they bounce around so much, they're non-progressible, and they're like, okay. Then they kind of gave in, fortunately. But others put them in indirect. So yeah, there's a lot of debate. And so just like they're debating those, whether those should be direct or indirect, the other companies are also debating whether or not the burdens and benefits are direct or indirect. In the end, it's all field cost. And the reason why I'm saying we don't, it's not wages, general conditions, and then overhead is because we tend to break out a lot of other items that kind of touch the directs, but we keep them separate. We got a fairly it's a fairly complex way to quantify and price it all. But it's been the way I'm going to show you is consistent through at least 4 different companies that I've worked for. So it's going to be a different approach than what you're used to in building construction. At the end of the day, we're all talking about the same thing. The building construction just tends to include it mostly in the subcontract unit rate, while the industrial tends to break it out into a bunch of categories and identifies it by item, because so much of what we do is not subcontracted.
Well, it's pay me now or pay me later. Somebody has to pay it.
Exactly.
Sometimes.
Exactly. At the end of the day, both approaches at the end of the day are billing the client for everything.
Right.
Yeah.
So you'll get this. I'll post this out there, so I won't go too much into it. But here's kind of some standard ratios that you'll find in our crews, and their variations because as I was showing you here, you've got two different approaches depending upon the size complexity of the company and what they're doing. This company that does this is probably bidding $1 to $30 million jobs. The company that does this is probably bidding 500 to $2.5–5 billion jobs. They roll more into the crew and they keep it a little less granular than this company will. And so consequently, your ratios change and vary. So that's it. If you go out to Canvas and pull down and download the templates I have out there for you, you have some wage rate templates, an estimating template, and there's one or two other templates out there. I don't remember what they are off the top of my head, but that you can use to put this effort together. You'll need to take the quantities out of the MTOs you developed and plug them into the estimating template. And
Yeah.
then I've given you a sheet to build your wage rate and your crews. I've given you the hours. I've given you a template or a database that you can pull your production rates from. I've given you a sheet that you can build your productivities in. I've given you a sheet that you can build your crew in. I've given you the wage rates to use, and I'm giving you the estimating template. And you'll want to put everything in the detail tab. So we'll spend some time Tuesday answering questions and going through anything that doesn't make sense to you. But I
I
think
zipped through. Yeah, if I may ask, I zipped through the task, the task 5, the hours, the crews, and the wages. This is a lot of work for the next few days.
yes,
Is there
it is.
any way that because we have a ton of other classes too that has similar. Is there any way that we can push that to the following week or to Sunday or something?
See, right now it's due on the 19th, so it's due next Thursday. I mean, we could there's nothing due on the 24th. So I could push it to the 24th.
That would be awesome.
Because
Because if you
what that actually does is it allows us to talk about it next Tuesday, and it gives you a week from when we talk about it.
yes.
Professor, that would be appreciated. It won't interfere with the baseball playoffs.
I hate baseball. I don't watch baseball. I'm focused on the assignment, man. It's a lot of work. If you read it, I read it. And I'm like, holy crap, we have 4 days to do this.
Yeah, it's not as bad as it seems, but if you're not used to it, it could be. So we'll have go through it and look at it all as much as you can over the weekend. We'll talk about it on Tuesday, and then we'll move the due date to the 24th. Now, another thing.
Mr. Whitman?
Yeah.
Excuse me. Mr. Whitman, to confirm, we are moving the due date to the 24th.
Yes.
All right, fantastic. One quick question. I got to hop off. I've got another meeting real quick. Have we figured out the how to upload the recordings of Zoom to Canvas?
I have not. I don't have them all yet either. But I'm talking with the lady that does that.
Wonderful. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Oh, and one other thing, and that is next Thursday. I don't know. I've got a business meeting in Canada coming up, and they're trying to figure out what day I'm supposed to be up there, and it may be next Thursday. It may be I may have to leave Tuesday, be up there all day Thursday, come back Friday. So next Thursday may be canceled. I will let you know as soon as possible. And if we do that, then if everybody just wants to go through the presentation and kind of digest it on your own, we can just leave things as they are. But if you want me to actually talk through it, then we can skip one of the self-directed days and I can go through the presentation on that day. So, but I gotta wait and find out if I'm actually going when, because they want it done like yesterday, but they're wanting to push it back. It's a normal indecision that we have to deal with in our industry. So
So
that's
Prof-
coming. Yes.
yeah, Professor Whitman, sorry, Steve here. I was completely unaware that we were having class tonight. I thought this whole week was off.
Yeah, no, it's just Monday, Tuesday.
That was not what was indicated last week. Just saying.
No, I've only talked about that's why I was saying we had the last Thursday when I was talking, or last time we met.
Last Thursday you were sick. You had to cancel.
Yeah, the
You had-
previous Tuesday, I was telling everybody we don't have class on Tuesday. We'll meet and have lecture on Thursday because remember I was talking about the schedule shifts.
Okay, just
Yeah.
well, just to let you know, I would have been on class tonight. I thought there was no class.
Okay.
So will this be recorded so that we can watch it later?
Yes, it was. Aaron was just asking about that, and I'm working with the lady that does that. I'm trying to get all those together, and then I think they've said that there's another way you access it. So I'm working with them to get that done. So I've been getting them all to her. She's been converting them. Now I'm trying to work with her on how do we get you access to that, but I don't have the final answer yet.
Okay.
But I'll continue to press that.
Right. My mistake. I should have gotten on class. I honestly thought that we were not meeting this entire week because none of the other classes have met. So I apologize.
Really? None of them met all week?
No.
That's interesting. Because my Monday, Tuesday, well, the Tuesday class that we normally had obviously didn't happen because but my Monday class didn't happen, but my Wednesday class I had yesterday. I had to drive up to College Station yesterday for that one. I'm surprised they canceled the whole week. That's weird.
Yeah.
Our 601 teacher never has a class on Wednesdays. She just posts a lecture. So
Oh, okay.
And she didn't even post a lecture this week.
she did. She posted it at 3:00 this morning.
At 3 this morning? Really?
Yeah, it's there.
Wow. All right.
Man, I don't know what she's doing at 3:00 in the morning. Don't want to know. That's way
She's
too.
still young. She's still young, Professor.
Oh, that explains a lot right there. Okay, I get it. All right, so but yeah, I'm gonna go into Canvas and I will change the due date from the 19th to the 24th on task 5.